Hello everyone, welcome to our NParks OneMillionTrees Webinar. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and YouTube. I'm Wansin and it's my honor to be your host for this afternoon. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the 1 Million Trees movement aims to restore nature back into our city through the planting of more than 1 million trees across Singapore over the next 10 years. This is a part of our efforts to transform Singapore into a city in nature, which is a key pillar under the Singapore Green Plan 2030. We are more than 1/3 of our way there, with more than 366,000 trees planted so far. In addition to tree planting, the 1 Million Trees movement also comprises of online activities, such as virtual tours and webinars like this one. So do check us out at our website at trees.sg and follow us on our NParks social media channels for updates. My colleague will be sharing the relevant links in the Zoom chat. For this 11th edition of our 1 Million Trees webinar, we are holding it in conjunction with Festival of Biodiversity 2022. The Festival of Biodiversity is an annual event which aims to create awareness and foster a sense of appreciation for our natural heritage. Do check out the website for a range of online and offsite activities for this year's festival. My colleague will be sharing the links to the website in the Zoom chat. In our previous webinars, our speakers shared about topics ranging from forest restoration to heritage trees and to the animal biodiversities that our trees support. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at the dazzling array of plant biodiversity that our trees have, such as orchids and hoyas. We have with us here today Michele and Mark, who will be able to tell us more about the epiphytic plants that live a high life among the trunks and branches of our trees. Michele is a senior researcher at the Singapore Botanic Gardens who specializes in hoyas, while Mark is the assistant curator of the National Orchid Garden. So after the sharing, we'll have a short Q&A session. If you have any questions along the way, do send them to Rachel as a private message using the Zoom chat. We'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, Michele and Mark, over to you, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will just start sharing my slides. Can you all see them? Okay. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon for this webinar. So I will be first introducing what are epiphytes and then zoom a bit deeper into some of the native species in the genus Hoya and in the genus Dischidia. So epiphytes, the name comes from Greek and simply means a plant that grows on top of another plant. But the definition is a bit more complex than this. So many plants grow on top of other plants. For example, lots of climbers, they germinate on the ground and then they climb on top of trees. Well, epiphytes tend to complete their entire life cycle on top of a host tree. Meaning that the seeds germinate, for example, on the bark of a tree, and then there they grow until they flower, fruit, and set seeds. They are, however, not parasitic, meaning that they do not really take any nutrients directly from the host plant, but they only use it for physical support. And other nutrients come from the rain, from runoff, from leaves, for example, or from nutrients that accumulate on the trunk surface. They're important for a variety of reasons. The first one is that simply they increase plant diversity. So they take up a habitat that would not really be taken by other plants on top of other trees. And they simply increase the number of species in a given habitat. This is mostly true for tropical and subtropical forests. Another reason is more ecological because they collect and store water from the rain. So the water doesn't just run off tree trunks and then go into the soil and then into rivers and lakes, but it's sort of stored, at least for a while, within the roots of the epiphytes. And so it's also true for nutrients. So the nutrients coming from the atmosphere and as runoff water sort of get locked for a while within the epiphytic plant communities. But then there is a lot more sort of importance because they are not just alone as plants, but they also interact with a number of animals. So there is a number of animals that, for example, live within epiphytic plants, and there's a lot of animals that rely and depend on epiphytic plants, for example, pollinators. So epiphytic plants usually tend to have pretty showy flowers, which have co-evolved together with pollinators. But in a way, to exemplify this more simply, some animals simply feed on epiphytes. So for example, in the picture here, we have ants that are feeding onto the nectar. So they just eat the sugar provided by an epiphytic plant. One example of this kind of interconnected microhabitat formed by epiphytic plants is the example of ant gardens. So ant gardens are fairly common in tropical forests and also fairly common in Asia and as well as in Singapore. So this is a community of different plant species that root on top of a tree trunk, and within the roots, ants will be nesting. So in a way, the plants form a house for the ants, and then the ants provide nutrients in form of droppings to the plant community. Epiphytic plants have developed various techniques to survive on trees. The main issue for them is usually the lack of water. You can imagine a plant that grows on top of a tree does not have access to a large amount of soil, for example, where water can accumulate. So some epiphytic plants simply avoid lack of water. So they have adapted to grow in forests where there is always water. Those are called mossy forests, and they do not really occur in Singapore, but are mostly common in high elevations throughout the tropics. So here there is a constant mist and constant rain, so plants never really dry out. But more commonly, epiphytic plants have developed specific morphological adaptation to withstand drying out. One of which is, for example, growing only during a rainy season, so saving water when water is not available. They, for example, can also drop their leaves, so reduce transpiration during dry spells. But also they have developed succulent leaves. We might associate succulent plants more to desert environments, but in this case, even epiphytes in a wet forest have developed very thick leaves which accumulate a lot of water, and they're covered by, for example, layers of waxes which reduce transpiration. You can see an example in the photo on the right, where the leaves are covered in white waxes, and there is a cut leaf that shows how thick and full of water it is. Epiphytic plants also have another issue growing up on top of a tree, which is seed dispersal. So you can see that the seeds have to sort of land on top of another tree. Most epiphytic plants have extremely small seeds, which can fly very easily. Other epiphytic plants have developed seeds with some kind of mechanisms for wind dispersal. So for example, they might be covered in very soft hair, which allow them to fly quite easily from one tree to another. The question, where can we find epiphytic plants, is multifaceted. We can intend it within a tree where we can find them, or where we can find them within a forest or within an environment. So within a tree, we can find epiphytes adapted to many different little ecological niches. So for example, some of them can grow in deep shade along the main trunk of a tree. Some of them can survive on more exposed location, maybe along a horizontal tree trunk. And some of them can grow in very, very exposed locations, for example, at the very tip of branches where there's a lot of wind, there is a lot of sun, and those plants are much higher risk of drying out, for example. You can also imagine that larger trees, like one in the image on the right, can harbor a much bigger diversity of epiphytes compared to smaller trees. And this really highlights the importance to preserve all trees and old growth forests, for example, because if all the trees are smaller, they will be able to host only a limited variety of epiphytes. When we can go to the question, where can we find within Singapore? Well, in Singapore, we can find lots of epiphytes along many of the roadside trees. One of the most common roadside tree is the rain tree, and this one has a lot of sort of horizontal spreading branches, and also has very rough bark, which can accumulate water as well as nutrients. So we can see a lot of epiphytes growing onto those trees. We just need to just look up and look closer onto the main branches of those trees. But of course, those are fairly common epiphytic plants. If you want to find more rarer species, those might only be found, for example, in specific parks or in specific nature reserves. So those cannot really be found commonly on roadside trees. About 10% of all plants are epiphytes. So you can imagine how important epiphytes are and how important it is to preserve them. And most of them are in tropical and subtropical forests. So this webinar is part of the 1 million tree movement. Well, all the trees planted as part of the 1 million tree movement are fairly small, but in the future, they will be able to host a large diversity of epiphytes as they grow bigger. And to give an example of the epiphytes that we have in Singapore, I'm just giving examples of orchids, hoyas, and Dischidias. There are, of course, many other ones ranging from ferns and mosses and so on. But orchid, for example, is a very large plant family, more than 26,000 species worldwide. Almost 70% are epiphytics. Hoyas is a large genus, most diverse in Southeast Asia, with up to 450 species, and 90% of those are epiphytic. And Dischidia is a smaller genus, about 80 species, and almost all of them are epiphytes. So you can really see how those groups of plants really rely on healthy forests and healthy trees for their survival. When we go into native species of orchids, hoyas, and Dischidias, orchids are 225 native species, but unfortunately 157 of them are currently considered locally extinct, mostly due to habitat loss. And quite a lot of them, of the existing ones, are considered critically endangered. Similarly, hoyas, there are only 13 native species. 4 of them are locally extinct, and almost half of the 13 species are critically endangered in Singapore. Dischidia, 9 species, 4 extinct, and 3 critically endangered. So again, there is a lot to do to try to support the preservation of native epiphytes. I will then proceed to give you some more information about the genus Hoya. The genus Hoya includes a lot of fairly showy species which are widely cultivated, so it might come a bit of a surprise that quite a number of them are actually native in Singapore. They have star-shaped flowers usually with 5 sepals, 5 petals, and 5 coronal lobes, which are the lobes you can see right in the center of the flower. But it's quite difficult to sort of define the morphology of a Hoya flower because, as you see in the picture, there's a lot of variation. The inflorescences can also be round, flat, concave. They can have from 1 flower to more than 100 flowers. There is a lot of variation. So we'll just give you some information about some of the native species. Hoya verticillata is one of the most common species throughout Southeast Asia, as well as elsewhere in Asia. So it goes from India all the way to the Solomon Islands. It's a huge distribution area. And in Singapore, it's one of the most common species. So this one can be found in parks, along roadsides, as well as in nature reserves. It's very free-flowering. The flowers in Singapore tend to be mostly white, but elsewhere it can also become pink or purple. It can really grow in many different habitats. So it can grow in deep shade as well as all the way to full sun. The flowers are quite nicely scented. And so this is probably the species that you might be able to spot more easily just looking up along roadsides. Another fairly common species that is quite remarkable because it has very large leaves. The specific name latifolia means the broadleaf Hoya. This one forms huge communities like the one you can see in the picture. It does flower a bit less frequently than Hoya verticillata, but it tends to flower a lot when it does. So it tends to have very long dangling branches, which produce hundreds of inflorescences with tens of flowers each. And the flowers can be from pale green to almost whitish, all the way to pale pink within the same plant. And again, this is fairly common in parks and nature reserves, a bit less on roadside trees, probably because it needs a bit more humid conditions. On the other hand, Hoya lacunosa is considered as a critically endangered species, and in contrast to the previous 2, this one forms fairly small plants which requires deep shade and very high humidity. So this might also explain why it is rarer. But in cultivation, as well as in the wild, it is free-flowering. It is a small plant that can also be grown in pots quite easily. The flowers are nicely scented. But yes, once again, it is widely available in cultivation and has a fairly large distribution area as well. But in Singapore, it's pretty rare. Hoya diversifolia This one is sort of in between rarity-wise, because this is considered as a vulnerable species. And in Singapore, it's only common in Pulau Ubin. It is not the easiest species to find because it really needs full sun to grow. And Pulau Ubin, the trees are fairly short, so it's fairly easy to find along roadsides in Pulau Ubin, but not really elsewhere. I did mention that a lot of species are considered nationally extinct, but this doesn't mean that there is no hope to still find them again in the wild. So for example, just late last year, Hoya coriacea, which was considered extinct for more than 120 years, was rediscovered by chance during a survey in Bukit Timah. This species has fairly thin leaves, and it grows in deep shade and high humidity. So this might be why it's not a common species in Singapore. So it really requires a very specific, very humid habitat, which is not very common anymore. But this species now is also cultivated, and we will do what our best to sort of bring up the numbers and reintroduce it back to the wild. Two species that are actually part of a program which aims to propagate and introduce native species back into suitable habitats is Hoya caudata and Hoya obtusifolia, which are part of the species recovery program. So those two species are fairly rare and only known from very few locations. Hoya caudata was known in Singapore for a very long time. Hoya obtusifolia was known in Singapore for a very long time, but considered extinct and only rediscovered within the last 10 years. While Hoya caudata was instead not known in Singapore up to about 11 years ago when it was found, and it was a new record for the Singapore flora. So again, there is not just hope to find species that we consider extinct, but also to find species that we did not know occurred in Singapore before. So those two species are currently being propagated and reintroduced in suitable habitats. I will move on to the genus Dischidia. The genus Dischidia has many features in common with the genus Hoya. So each flower has 5 sepals, 5 petals, and 5 coronal lobes. But the flowers tend to be small, urn-shaped, and usually one or very few in each inflorescence. So those are the main characters to separate them from species of Hoya, even though both Hoya and Dischidia have a lot of species that have a very wide morphological variability. So for example, in the two pictures in the bottom right, I put a typical Hoya and a typical Dischidia. So those are very easy to tell apart. But other species might be trickier to tell apart. I will just introduce 2 species of Dischidia. The first one is Dischidia numularia, called the coin-shaped Dischidia because the leaves are round and sort of look like a coin. Dischidia numularia, as well as many other Dischidia species in Singapore, are fairly common, but very difficult to spot. So Dischidia numularia grows, for example, on many of the trees in Singapore Botanic Gardens. You see it here on a monkey pot tree, but unless I put those red circles, you might not be able to see those tiny little strings of leaves dangling down. But the tree and most of these branches are actually covered in this species. It is fairly common in Singapore as well as throughout Southeast Asia. It grows in full sun as well as in deep shade. It's a very variable and adaptable species. And this one is probably the one that you will be able to see the most on rain trees throughout the island. And here are some close-ups of the leaves. You see they are almost round, and this is probably why it was called a coin leaf Dischidia. The flowers are quite pretty, but they are very, very small, as most Dischidia species flowers. And the second species I would like to introduce is Dischidia major. This one does form a much larger plants and has also showier flowers and showier leaves, but it prefers coastal habitats where there is a lot of wind and a lot of sun, or it grows at the very top of the tree canopy. So again, it's quite difficult to spot just looking up from below a tree canopy. It really thrives in full sun, so it would not really be able to survive on lower branches. And so it is fairly common, for example, commonly seen at least in Pulau Ubin, where you can access to a lot of lower trees along the coastline. The quite interesting feature of this species is that it has two types of leaves. So it has almost roundish leaves, like most other species, but also has those pouch-shaped leaves. So you see on the picture on the left, the entire bunch of pouch-shaped leaves. And on the right, there is one that has been cut. And those pouch-shaped leaves are quite odd because the roots of the plant grow inside the pouch-shaped leaves. And within this enclosure, ants tend to nest within. So I mentioned before ant gardens. Dischidia major forms ant gardens, but also has sort of ant houses within the plant itself. So it's ecologically very, very interesting. And this is the last slide of my presentation, and Mark will take on talking about many beautiful orchid species.
Hi everyone, my name is Mark and I'll be talking about orchids in Singapore today. So the orchid family, the orchids are monocots. They have modified petals. So what that means is that they have the petals occur in sets of trees, either 3, 6, or 9 petals. But most orchids actually have 6 petals. Physically, you can actually just count 5 because one of the petals, the 6th one, is actually modified into a labellum. So to delve into that very briefly, the labellum is a is a landing pad for many of its pollinators. And if you look at the Bromhedia finlaysoniana picture, that yellow portion, that is the labellum, which is actually a modified petal. So the orchid family is the 2nd largest flowering plant group in the world, second behind only to the asters. It has 26,000 species spread across 760 genera. They are a very diverse group of plants, and they can grow in every continent except Antarctica. So orchids can be found growing in all sorts of different altitudinal ranges. They can be found growing from the warm lowlands to intermediate conditions to the highlands, where temperatures can drop as low as 16 degrees. The orchid family, orchids exist as epiphytes, lithophytes, and terrestrials. Epiphytes grow on trees without taking moisture from the trees itself, as Michele has mentioned earlier. Lithophytes on rocks, and they grow as terrestrials in the ground. And as Michele mentioned earlier, 70% of the family are epiphytes. Okay, so in orchids in Singapore, the orchids are intertwined with our cultural heritage. With our national flower being the infamous Vietnamese Joachim. It was hybridized by an Armenian lady many years ago in her home. Singapore also is engaged in orchid diplomacy. Orchid diplomacy occurs when visiting heads of state come to Singapore, and we gift orchids away to these visiting countries with the orchids. These new hybrids, they are named for the visiting heads of state. And so this is something that's very unique to Singapore, and it's done nowhere else in the world. And in Singapore, within the National Orchid Garden, within the Singapore Botanic Garden, we do have the National Orchid Garden. And within the National Orchid Garden, we have more than 1,500 orchid species and more than 3,000 orchid hybrids, making us one of the largest orchid gardens in the world. And besides that, we do have a recently opened tropical montane orchidum attraction, which opened about a year ago. Orchid conservation in Singapore. As Michele mentioned earlier, we have 225 species of native orchids, 64 critically endangered species, and actually, sorry, I made a typo, it should be 157 nationally extinct species. So with many species being nationally extinct, the National Parks Board started the Orchid Conservation Program in 1995 to monitor these threatened species and explore ways to increase its ex situ stock. So some ways that we do it are through divisions and through multiplication of these orchids through making new seed pods of the same plant, and then we will artificially germinate them in our orchid laboratory. The National Parks Board also has a species recovery program, and this is not just limited to orchids, but for orchids alone, we propagate 10 orchid species for reintroduction into parks, streetscapes, and our nature reserves. Again, some of these orchids we would propagate them by divisions, and also that artificial germination of our seeds in our labs as a long-term approach to have a good stock of all these plants. I would like to talk about the adaptations of orchids and what makes orchids so special. So orchids have modified flowers. In terms of the labellum that you saw earlier, they serve as a landing pad for pollinators to land, and then they would then take the pollinia from the plant. So it makes it easier for the orchids. They don't have to hover. They're able to land on the labellum and take the pollen. Some orchids also have a spur. If you look at the Angraecums, the squipedale picture, that long portion of the in the orchid is actually the spur. And this spur actually is adaptation for pollination. In Africa, it is pollinated by a hawk moth, and what actually happens is the hawk moth will hover at the orchid, and it will extend out its long proboscis to reach the nectar at the base of the spur, and in the process, taking the pollinia from the orchid and eventually moving it to another orchid. Some orchids are also fragrant. They produce jasmine-like fragrance, sweet fragrances that attract its pollinators in terms of bees and butterflies. Some orchids are also foul-smelling, and in return, they actually attract flies. The smell often smells like rotting flesh or rotting carrion, and hence you look at the bulbophyllum lasianthum picture. That's where the foul smell has attracted all these flies to it. The timing of flowering also is modification to the flowers. Some orchids flower in the day, they attract butterflies and bees. And some orchids actually open their flowers at night. And those orchids, also again, like brassavolas, they will open at night, and hence they attract moths and even bats to pollinate the flowers. Some orchids also mimic other organisms. So Masdevallia lafleurii is one such example. The labellum of this Masdevallia actually mimics mushrooms, and that attracts gnats and mites to come and pollinate the orchid. Orchids as epiphytes also have modified leaves. Some orchids have thick, waxy, and large leaves to reduce water loss. Often these orchids can be found in dry deciduous, in some deciduous forests whereby there's prolonged period of lack of rain. So with these large leaves are able to help to reduce this water loss. And also being up in the canopy where sometimes there is abundance of light that punches through the canopy, these waxy leaves are able to prevent water loss when the light hits the leaves. Some orchids also have large pseudobulbs to store water. Again, during drought periods or periods of prolonged dry weather, the water in these pseudobulbs helps to sustain and prolong the plants. Some orchids, such as the bulbophyllum beccarii, are able to trap falling leaves from the trees. These leaves actually get trapped in the center of the bulbophyllum leaves, and in turn, they get broken down into nitrogen for the plant. So this is nature's way of actually fertilizing the orchids. Orchids as epiphytes also have modified roots in the form of the velamen layer. Velamen is it's an outer coating on the roots. They are usually spongy, and they prevent, what it does is that it prevents the harsh UV light from actually damaging the roots. It also helps the epiphytes, these epiphytic roots, absorb atmospheric water and nutrients. And it usually when the orchid roots are dry, you can see development as a very gray, gray silvery layer. However, when the orchid roots are wet, they actually turn green, and this exposes the photosynthetic cells below. So similarly, if you look at the close-up of the orchid roots, you can see that the root tips are green, and hence what makes these epiphytic roots so special is that this portion of the roots is able to photosynthesize and take in sunlight that's converted to chlorophyll. So we also select orchids for our streetscapes as part of the species recovery program. So we do have certain criteria. Firstly, we do plant out, the orchids that we plant out are all native. We do make sure that these orchids are also drought tolerant, as the orchids that go out onto the streetscapes and parks, they do not always get watered. So they are reliant on rainwater to be sustained. As these orchids are also, they're left on their own once they are planted out onto our streetscapes. We need them to be pest resistant. Unlike the orchids in the orchid garden, we're able to keep them protected with pesticides and fungicides. The orchids on the streetscapes do not have such protection. Generally, these orchids need to be of low maintenance. Again, when there are periods of heavy rains and periods of prolonged drought in Singapore, these orchids will need to have enough vigor to sustain on their own. Also, the orchids we choose, we will choose orchids that are aesthetically pleasing, such as the Cymbidium filaceonianum. They do provide pops of color, and for people so people are able to see them when they are flowering. We also choose orchids that are free flowering and that are able to flower multiple times a year. And of course, we would like to choose orchids that produce large blooms, like the tiger orchid, which I will show you guys later, so that when Singaporeans, when they're driving along the roadsides, they are able to see these large blooms flowering on the trees. So some suitable trees for tying orchids. We do have certain trees that we prefer to tie orchids on and that have higher success rate of orchids growing on them. So generally, we choose trees with rough bark. The rough, coarse bark helps the epiphytic roots latch onto them, and they have stronger attachment to the tree. With a strong attachment, these trees are unlikely to fall off when there's periods of heavy storms, and the strong winds will not let the orchids. The strong winds will not blow the orchids off the trees. We also choose trees that can withstand moisture on their bark. With these epiphytic orchids nestled on the trees, there's actually additional moisture, and so we choose trees that are able to take this moisture that is going in between the bark and the orchid that is attached on the tree. Generally, we avoid trees that shed leaves, such as Cratosylum and Chrysonopsis species. Often, what happens with these two tree species is that their bark will peel off and flake off, and often when their orchids tied onto these tree species, the orchids get peeled off as well. Often, these two tree species also have generally very smooth bark, and the orchid roots generally don't grow very well on them. We also avoid trees that exude resins. Certain trees do produce certain chemicals, and those inhibit the orchids from growing on them. So I'll just run through a list of four tree species that generally we've had quite good success with. These are just four of many of the native tree species that are planted out there. Fagrea auriculata is one. We do have Barbophyllum mycoianum growing very well on them within the National Orchid Garden. And with the yellow flame, you can see lots of orchids growing on them, Cymbidiums and tiger orchids growing on them along Holland Road. And even with the Nima globulera, you get some coastal species of orchids growing on them. And of course, with the yellow rain tree, and even the normal rain tree, as there's such these big trees that gives a lot of space for tying orchids on them. often there's quite a lot of shade within the yellow rain trees, and that makes that environment very conducive for orchids to grow on them. So I will now go through a list of native orchid species that can commonly be found growing on trees on our streetscapes and our parks. The first one is the Grammatophyllum speciosum. It is the largest orchid in the world. It's commonly known as the tiger orchid because of its markings on its petal. Typically, they bloom in July and August after a period of prolonged dry and hot weather. So that triggers the flowering. One adaptation that this orchid has is that it has needle-like roots. So these needle-like roots are actually very sharp. They face up skywards and they actually trap falling leaves from the tree, and that in turn is broken down into a nitrogen source for the plant. These orchids are able to get up to 1 ton in weight, and sometimes they even grow as terrestrials when they are in the wild. When they get so big, they actually fall off trees and they just start to grow on the ground below the trees as well. This orchid is pollinated by solitary bees, so they are a relatively large bee, and when they're flowering, there's a light scent that actually attracts the bees to the flower. The next orchid is Cymbidium finlaysonianum. It is found throughout Southeast Asia in primary rainforests. This species is critically endangered in Singapore, and this species is actually pollinated by stingless bees. Stingless bees are also known as the sweat bees. They are very small bees, and they, as its name suggests, it's stingless. These orchids produce pendulous inflorescence up to 90 cm long and about 30 flowers on each inflorescence. And from experience, this species of orchid, once they are matured and they are settled nicely on the tree after a year or two, they are able to flower freely throughout the year. The next orchid is Calostylus porcella. This orchid is one of the 10 species in our species recovery program, which we are propagating these orchids back of house in our National Orchid Garden nursery. So this orchid produces attractive orange flowers. It is a sequential bloomer, and what I mean by a sequential bloomer is that every time it will produce about 2 to 3 flowers at each time, and once these flowers fade, another flower will open. So it opens in succession, and the flower stalk is able to last 3 to 6 months. In the wild, they grow as dense mats, and they have a very distinct elongated rhizome. If you look at the second picture, between each pseudobulb, that's that distinct elongated rhizome. Generally, this orchid grows well in shady and humid environments, and it was rediscovered in Yishun Swamp in 2012. The next orchid is quite a common orchid in Singapore, and I think many of you might have, if you have looked up, you might have seen it flowering a couple of days after rain. This is the pigeon orchid, and the blooms are not very lasting. They just last for a day, and the blooms are triggered by drops in temperature caused by heavy rains. So typically, after a heavy rain, 7 days later, you would see a profusion generally across the island or where it rained on these flowers. It has a jasmine-like fragrance and is found throughout Southeast Asia in both lowland and intermediate growing conditions. The next orchid species is Coelogene racussenii. This orchid doesn't like too much sunlight. It grows well under partial sun. Generally, they bloom around March, and around Chinese New Year period. The flowers have a very light lemony scent, doesn't hit you very strong, but it's quite a pleasant smell. It's very attractive, and it produces up to 40 inflorescences at each time. And each inflorescence or each flower stalk produces up to 30 flowers. The next orchid is also a yellow-colored orchid. It's the Aboveground maginatum. This orchid grows as dense mats Well, I often see it on rain trees in Singapore. They like shady and humid conditions. And when the entire clump flowers, that's actually when you notice the orchid. You will see pops of color you will see pops of color on the trees itself. And in Indonesia, the fruits of this species are blended together, and they actually, and when ingested, they help to cure pains in the ear. The next orchid is Echinopsis liliifolia. It's another orchid within the species recovery program. It looks somewhat like a small tiger orchid based on the leaves and the roots. They produce small white and pink flowers on a branching inflorescence. What do I mean by a branching inflorescence is that the flower stalk actually has side shoots coming off it, of flowers. So it looks like a branch of flowers. The flowers are produced year-round and they're relatively free-flowering, so they flower about 4 to 5 times a year, and there's no distinct period for their flowering. And this plant has medicinal properties. It can bring down fevers that derive from malaria. The next orchid is Phalaenopsis cornucervi. This is Singapore's only native Phalaenopsis. It's commonly known as the deer-antlered Phalaenopsis. And again, this is another sequential bloomer, and the flower stalks can last up to 3 months on end. There's a high this species is highly varied. So what that means is that you can get them in different color forms. They generally have the same shape, but what that means is that they have different colors. So the first picture on the left, you can see an all red color, and the picture on the right, the red is more speckled and more spotted. Hence, it's a highly varied species. There's also a flava form which is all yellow. This Phalaenopsis is pretty hardy. It's able to take higher light conditions compared to other Phalaenopsis. This species can actually grow close to full sun conditions. Of course, the leaves get a bit yellower when grown in full sun conditions. The next orchid is Rhodobaeketia spatulata, another orchid that is part of the species recovery program. It is a monopodial orchid that grows downwards rather than upwards. So what is a monopodial orchid? A monopodial orchid is an orchid that has one stem and it grows upwards. But in this case, this orchid actually, it doesn't really grow downwards, but it grows outwards, and then because of the weight, it kind of leans down. And when it leans downwards, actually, we hypothesize that triggers the flowering in the plants. And this orchid produces pendulous flowers. They aren't very big. They're about 4 cm wide, and they grow on a single inflorescence. This orchid was rediscovered in Pulau Ubin in 2006, and it can be found growing as far up in Southeast Asia as the Himalayas. The last orchid I'll be talking about today is the Bulbophyllum Praetovissum. It's also part of one orchid within the species recovery program and has resupinate flowers. The word resupinate actually means upside down. So actually, if you notice, the dorsal sepal, which is usually the upright part of the orchid, is actually the whole orchid is actually upside down. So resupination in orchids actually is purported to help the pollinators pollinate the flowers a bit more easily, as there's nothing blocking, or the position of the pollinia makes it easier for the pollinators to fly in and take the pollinia away to other plants. This species is pollinated by flies, and it's very similar looking to Bulbophyllum macranthum, which is the picture on the bottom. The difference in these two species is that the labellum of Bulbophyllum Praetovissum actually is hooked. So if you can see in the first picture, the top part of the flower, there's 2 sharp hooks. Those are, they're a bit more elongated and they look like hooks, compared to Bulbophyllum macranthum, which end off as 2 points. And that's the difference between these two species. So as we conclude this presentation, just like to let everyone know that actually epiphytes are all around us. I think in Singapore we are very unique. It's very unique, and we're very privileged to have not just trees but epiphytes growing on these trees. And each tree, especially large trees, can actually form a microclimate for a whole lot of different sorts of epiphytes, both orchids, and plants, and Dischidias and Hoyas, including ferns. They are very much part of our ecosystem. And so when you're walking around wherever you are, in our parks, along our roadsides, don't forget to look up and marvel at the diversity of epiphytes on our trees. At the same time, join us and support the 1 million tree movement, and join us to plant more trees to support the movement, and this will help provide more space for epiphytes to grow on our trees. And with that, I'll end this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michele and Mark, for your very interesting and insightful sharing. Okay, for now, we have received several questions from the audience. So let's move on to Q&A. I apologize in advance if I'm unable to address all the questions due to overwhelming response. So for our very first question, why do some rain trees have more epiphytes than others? Either of you want to take this question?
Yeah, hi. I believe that it depends on many factors. So rain trees overall have more epiphytes than other trees because of the way they generally are shaped with those horizontal branches. But some rain trees might grow, for example, in areas that has less wind. Maybe some rain trees grow further away from the sea, and those might have more epiphytes, while rain trees along roads that are closer to the sea might have less, or maybe different types of epiphytes that are not as visible.
Okay, so I guess
there's more of an ecological question. And of course, older rain trees tend to have more epiphytes rather than younger trees. So it's possible that the person that brought up this question has in mind maybe roads where the rain trees are younger and they might show less epiphytes on them.
Okay. Now for the next question then, how does NParks conserve epiphytes through the species recovery program? So I think the both of you touched a bit about this earlier on. Yeah, just maybe some greater detail on the species recovery program.
Okay, I can take this. So the species recovery program serves to protect and conserve these critically endangered species. So what we do is at the back of house, we propagate these species, and either through divisions, so we would divide the plants, or in the case of orchids, we would make a selfing, or sorry, not a selfing. We'll propagate the species through seeds, and then we will bring it to our lab to artificially germinate them and grow out the plants to full sizes, and then we will reintroduce them to our trees in our streetscapes and parks.
Okay, that's a very interesting behind the scenes look at how you conserve our species. Thanks, Mark. The next question, are epiphytes part of the Flora of Singapore project? Okay, maybe I know Michele, you're part of this project. Maybe explain more about what the Flora of Singapore is.
I can take this one. So the Flora of Singapore is a project that started 3 years ago, and it ran for about 10 years. And it is to produce a series of books as well as online PDFs on all the plant diversity within Singapore. So this will provide descriptions of the plants, synonymies, identification keys, as well as lots of photographs and line drawing illustrations. And indeed, epiphytes are part of Flora of Singapore project. Hoyas and Dischidias have already been published in 2019, and then orchids will follow a few years later. But as part of Flora of Singapore, we also include all the other epiphytes, including the ferns and even the mosses. So if you check on the SPG website, you will be able to find a link to publications and then Flora of Singapore, and you will be able to find more information about it.
Okay, thanks, Michele. So if you are interested, you can Google the Singapore Botanic Gardens website and take a look. Okay, then the next question is maybe what are some ways that epiphytes disperse and start growing on trees?
I can take this one as well. So I briefly mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that a lot of epiphytes have very small seeds that are wind dispersed. So in a way, the plants produce hundreds, thousands, or millions of those very small seeds, which will just blow off in the wind, and by chance will find a suitable spot for germination. But some other species have other mechanisms which are more specialized. So they might produce a tuft of hair, which allow the seeds to really float in air for much longer. And some species will also produce fruits or seeds which are attracted by ants, will attract ants or other insects. So those insects will take the seeds, bring them onto their nest, which most likely will be nearby, still on the tree or on a different tree, and there the seed will germinate. So in a way, the plant devises a mechanism to germinate in a place where there is also food for the plant, so within the ant nest. Those are just some of the mechanisms, yeah.
Okay. Maybe, Mark, do you have anything to add on for like orchids, how the orchids disperse and start growing on trees as well?
Well, orchids have dust-like seeds, and for orchid seeds to germinate in the wild, they would actually need mycorrhiza. So mycorrhiza is a kind of fungus, and as long as the trees have this mycorrhiza, the seeds will be able to germinate. And because the seeds are dust-like, they're kind of carried around by wind.
Okay, thank you both. Now, okay, the next question is, how can we grow such epiphytes at home? And if we can, how can we recreate the same environment in our homes for these epiphytes?
Maybe I can start answering this one.
Okay.
So as we mentioned, there are many different epiphytes around, and many are available in nurseries in Singapore. So I think it really depends. Rather than change the environment of our homes, it's a matter of choosing the epiphytes that might grow pretty well at home. So if our home, for example, is our grow area is very hot and sunny, we might need to choose some of the more succulent and hardy species, while if we have a grow area that is shady and humid, we might need to choose different types of epiphytes. I think this would be at least what I would do. Try to, instead of changing the environment, try to pick the plants that are best suited for it.
Yeah, and just to add on, I think it's always important to do some prior research before buying these epiphytes to put at home, to know the growing conditions, as Michele mentioned. So if you know the growing conditions, you are able to recreate these environments.
Okay, so that's the advice for any budding gardeners at home who want to grow Hoyas and orchids. Okay, next one. Okay, what is your favorite epiphyte and why? Both of you can take this question. Maybe Mark, you can start first.
Well, I guess my favorite epiphytes is orchids. Well, my favorite is actually Dendrobium spectabile. It's a species. Sorry, it's not native, but it's a species from Papua New Guinea, and it is one of those oddballs of the orchid family. And yeah, it's just so sinister. Well, it's not. It looks weird. It just looks like a fried squid.
Interesting. Okay, maybe Michele, your favorite epiphyte?
This is a very tough question because my favorite keeps changing. Usually, it's the one that I do not know enough about. So when I find something new, interesting, exciting, then it becomes my favorite. But if I have to choose one of the Singapore natives, I will probably go for Dischidia major, because there's this very fascinating ecology with the ants living within. So again, it's a very unusual species with lots of interactions with animals as well.
Yeah, and it's one of the species that you shared earlier, right? During
Yes, the last one in the presentation.
Okay, I think I do have time for one more question that just came in through the Zoom chat. Okay, so I didn't have time to add this in because it just came in. The question is, do these plants, the epiphytes, deprive the host trees of the necessary nutrients? So, Mark,
yeah, I could take this. So because these are epiphytes, they treat the tree or its whole structure, yeah, in this case trees, as a support to grow and latch on. So these epiphytes will find its own ecological niche, probably high up in the tree, and yeah, they don't take nutrients from the tree, but they just use the tree as a support structure to take in nutrients and water from the surrounding environment. So not from the tree itself, but from the environment around it.
Okay, I think that's our final question. So once again, thank you to Mark and Michele for your sharing and your answers on the Q&A. And also thank you to our audience on Zoom and YouTube for joining us today. So while Michele and Mark continue in their efforts to conserve the vast array of epiphytes that grow on our trees, you too can make a difference by being part of the 1 Million Trees movement. So you can check out our website, TreesSG, and connect with us on our NParks social media channels. You may also scan the QR code here to sign up for our mailing list. Okay, before we go, we would like your honest feedback on our webinar today so that we may continue to deliver engaging and relevant content to you. You may scan the QR code here or follow the link sent in the Zoom chat to complete a short survey on today. So I'll leave this here for a while. And in the meantime, a billion thanks to everyone, and we hope you have a great day ahead.